Can you introduce yourself for people watching?
So my name is David Lancefield. I call myself a catalyst, strategist, and coach. I help leaders deliver exceptional things for themselves and for their organisation. And I used to be a senior partner in strategy and in PwC.
Could you share what's like your story to what's led you to working in the work you're doing now?
Yeah, nice, easy one to start off with. Thanks, man. Yeah. So I got to a point, I guess I've been a partner for 14 years, enjoyed the organisation, enjoyed the role. And I was looking ahead thinking, where am I going? And it was all fine. I have no complaints and I have great relationships with the organisation. But I thought, I want to try something new, try a new challenge, some adventures, and also get a bit of personal flexibility at home, given I have a son who's disabled. And so it wasn't because I was bored necessarily or anything particularly wrong. I know that makes for a better story. But I sort of thought, hey, I was 45 at the time, 46 now. I thought, let's try something new. And so I decided to set up sort of on my own, working with collaborators in trying to help leaders of all shapes and sizes and forms be, amazing people, and trying to combine, I guess, my skill as a strategist and also a business leader, as I was in PwC, in various guises, and also somebody who's got an executive coaching background. So sort of trying to bring all those elements together. And I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying it, even with COVID and the pandemic and homeschooling and so on. It's been a good ride so far.
Yeah, and you've been sharing your journey on LinkedIn and other platforms, and I've seen the way people have responded to it, and I find it inspiring because I saw you when I knew you were kind of this figure at the top of the organization, but it's really like humbling to know that you don't mind being vulnerable and sharing like the wins and the challenges you've been having along the way.
I appreciate you saying that. Hey, let's be clear. Doing something on your own, whatever you call it, solopreneur, individual, running a business, there's lots to take from my previous roles. There's a lot of new things. The big thing when you're a partner in a big organization is leverage. You'll know that word, how you multiply your impact with others. When you're on your own, you can still have a big impact on others, but it's not as though you've got a big team around you. And candidly, you haven't got a big brand behind you standing by. So anybody who says that they're, their own individual brand working within a big company or corporate or consultancy, yeah, you have your own individual brand. But let's be really clear, the mother brand helps you a lot. So what I've been doing is having to create, a new brand for myself. And I guess the hardest thing, Matt, if I may say so, is not looking at people who I admire, who are doing what I'm doing now, who have been doing it for 5, 10, 15, 20 years and think, oh, shouldn't I be there already? And I've only been doing it for a few months. It's easy to look in that way and get frustrated with yourself. So patience is something I'm trying to learn or relearn as I'm sort of trying to climb the ladder. And also just have some fun along the way. I've got to a stage where I can now have some fun, do the things I want to do, and make some choices. I guess a strategist after all.
Yeah, I really appreciate like being reminded about patience, because like one of my probably strengths and weaknesses is my ambition, and so eager for things to go as I hope they will. But then when I look back, some of the things I'm most like proud of now or happy with have been as a result of when I've been when something's happened that I wasn't how I wanted things to be.
Yes.
So yeah, it's a good reminder. So when I approached you, I was really keen for you to be part of this because I wanted a bunch of the Culturevists to discover you. When you asked me, like, where would you like me to focus? The area I was really keen on was culture in the C-suite.
Yeah.
And the reason for today's conversation being the kind of intersection of those two is because Culturevist is all about company culture and well-being. And as I mentioned, I saw you, not that I don't now, but when we worked together, I saw you having conversations that I wouldn't have been part of with the senior level. And I was always wondering, like, what do they talk about? Like, what is behind the mystery? So I feel really fortunate that we're going to start to explore that. And I know we won't cover everything now, but it's a chance for me to kind of pull back the cover. So I think a good place to start would be with sharing our views of definitions. So when we say C-suite, what does that mean?
So C-suite is the executive level of an organization, comprising, if you like, the decision makers. So clearly the chief executive officer, CEO, and other C roles like CFO, chief financial officer, COO, chief operations officer. These are the people who are in the executive committee, if it's a corporate, and a smaller group of those, typically the CEO, CFO, and perhaps the HR director sometimes are on the board. So they're the decision makers. They sponsor activities, they sponsor culture, they're responsible. And just to be clear, I do invite others into some of those conversations, and I didn't sort of bar you. It was more that sometimes these people want to talk one-to-one, if it's a private matter. So before you think otherwise.
Yeah, if you've judged David already, not because of that. Okay, yeah, thank you for kind of offering a view on what is the C-suite. So next, if we're looking at culture in the C-suite, given your experience and your perspective, how do you define company culture? What do you see it as?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this because it's probably one of the terms that is most used at the moment, given topics we're going to talk about. And probably if you ask people, there isn't one definition. So I'll offer my definition. I will answer the question, but I don't think there's one textbook answer, unlike perhaps some other terms that we might talk about. When I think about culture, I think of the behaviors, the norms, the beliefs, the values that explain how work gets done in an organization. It's something that is, I think, an emotional sort of, if you like, concept rather than something rational. And John Katzenbach, who's a former colleague of mine who's written extensively on this topic and a good friend, talks about, he says this is something that's more implicit than explicit. So it's not something you walk in the building and there's some big placard that has, here is our culture. People may talk about it, but you sort of have to get under the skin of the organization to understand it. And the one thing I would say, and you and I might disagree on this, who knows, is value statements or traits like we believe in integrity, we believe in honesty and so on, are aspects of culture, but they're not enough in its own right. Because if you want to change culture, if you said to somebody, come on, let's be more honest, or show some more integrity or authenticity, I mean, what do you do with that? You have to turn it into, a behavior, a day-to-day behavior, which says, for example, if you're in a meeting and you disagree with something, you're welcome to speak up, or something like a one or two liner that explains the behavior that you want in an organization. So there you go. That's my first stab.
I'm still trying to figure out if I'm going to agree or disagree with you on this. On this one, I agree with you, I believe. So the way I see it is culture is a combination of the different influences that are acting within an organization, and then anyone who interacts with that organization. So if I'm a colleague in that company, there are different things that are going to influence the way I think and the way I behave. Some of those are personal to me.
Yes.
So my background, my upbringing, my experiences, maybe what the last company I worked at, things to do with me will influence how I perceive. So if I previously worked at a company with an amazing approach to well-being, that might influence how I view the well-being, like the environment for well-being here compared to someone else. So things to do with me, things to do with the environment will influence me. So the physical environment, the way people communicate, the way people dress, the way budget is allocated. And then external factors will influence how I am. So industry regulation, the country we're in, and so on. Yeah. So culture is the combination of the different influences, whichever of these are acting on me. Values will be one of those, I think. So it's one of the influences that makes up the culture. Some people, I think, may be influenced by the values more than others. Many may not be aware of it. So it will have a different impact on the culture for different people. But I think values can have a disproportionate impact on the culture because they potentially are intended to influence all the different aspects of things that can be controlled in an organization.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. I would say that a lot of what you said there, for me at least, and hey, this is just two opinions, but I guess it is important when people are in organizations are talking about culture, that they actually have, at least when they're talking about how they can evolve it and change it. There's an argument whether you can change culture or just evolve it. We may touch on that. But the point is, if you're doing work on it, right, you have to understand what you all mean by it and actually talk about it. That's often missing. By the way, people talk about it in the abstract and you say, well, what are you actually talking about here? I think the influences you talked about for me are the context for culture. They influence the culture. The culture for me is about all the factors. And I think values very much so are an integral part, a very important part. It's all the elements that explain how work actually gets done. It's some of the unwritten rules. And I guess the challenge when you're leading transformational change in particular, is you have to try and, if you like, capture what it is explicitly in order to work out what you build from. I mean, cultural change that starts from a blank sheet of paper or from an outside-in perspective, where you say, "Oh, we're all broken here. We need to copy this company that's amazing." Typically, a tech company from the US is normally the answer. Doesn't work because you've got so much history and context, to your point, Matt, that you need to build on. There will be strengths, but if you need to understand what they are and talk about them explicitly before you can work out how do you tweak them, change them, evolve them.
I really appreciate that. So yeah, we've offered two kind of related, overlapping perspectives on culture. So if you're watching this, like, something to consider is, how do you view it? And it doesn't need to be the same as our definitions, but how do you view it? And maybe if you're part of a company, how do others in your organization view it? And has it been discussed? And maybe that potentially
has the C-suite team actually described it? So, it's okay for a team to do their work on culture, their own culture, which is fine. There's lots of micro cultures within organizations, but you have to be aligned and supportive and empowered by the culture set by the C-suite. And so there is something about, look for it. What do you, if you look through, the last presentation, the town hall, the annual report, whatever it is, what type of communication, what have they said about culture, and how can you translate that into your day-to-day? And just one point about autonomous organizations, because I might be sounding like some old traditional corporate entity, that has a C-suite. Founder-led businesses, from scale-ups to some of the larger businesses, hire, for example, the Chinese appliance manufacturer, and lots of other things it does. It seems to be one of the cool examples at the moment. There's a C-suite in that organization. It may be smaller than many of the corporates that people have worked with traditionally, but there's still a group of people at the top, maybe 1, 2, or 3, maybe 10, who make decisions and have explicitly made statements about culture. I mean, the next Netflix case study is well known, where they, the HR director and Reed Hastings Patty McCord and Reed Hastings put a PowerPoint together that went viral. It was over 100 pages that described the culture. Some organizations do that. Some it will be more implicit in what they say in their communication. I think that's worth starting with, because if you're doing your own work, you have to understand the overall direction. Otherwise, well, the best outcome could be you evolve a culture that they think, oh, that's amazing, that's brilliant, we want to take it and scale it across the organization. That's the best outcome. That's rare, by the way. Worst outcome is somebody at the top says, hang on, we were pretty clear. Hopefully they involved you in the shaping of the culture. We're pretty clear about what we expect. You're going in a different direction. Can you tell me how that's helpful? So at least, have a look around. Have a look around.
I really appreciate you calling out that even though people may not realize that these organizations that are talked about so much as being progressive, while they are progressive, there are things that people may associate with more traditional companies. I experienced that. I know people have been talking about self-managed organizations for decades. And I had a brief period of working in with holacracy and in different self-managed ways of working.
Yeah.
And actually there isn't a, people think that it's not about kind of hierarchy and control, but actually it's a different type of it.
Yes, great point. Great point.
So yeah, I think what's wonderful is when there's a lot of buzz around like new ways of working and progressive ways of working, but actually let's demystify and see what actually happens in practice.
That's the point. See, that's exactly the point. Sorry to interject. That's the point. It's like, you read case studies. You might read, if you're joining the organization, you might read the blurb and the recruitment interview. That's all fine. Got to get underneath the surface and say, how does it actually work? And I remember interviewing James Timpson, the CEO of Timpson's, which is on the high street, still around and still a great family business. And it's well known to having a great culture in the organization, very progressive, inclusive in terms of the people it hires from younger, from ex-offenders, and very, it gives lots of benefits. But he was crystal clear, right? He was crystal clear that they have to earn it, right? So the standards are really high. The quality is very clear of what he expects, and they're progressive in terms of helping people perform at that level. But if you don't, you're managed out of the business. So as opposed to this sort of mindset, and you have some of the new companies, GitHub's being a new example of that in terms of remote working, as many holidays as you want. It comes, there's always a quid pro quo, right? You may have more flexibility in some ways, but there are bounds to it. Somebody at the top, especially in founder-led businesses, will be very, very clear about what they expect, and the performance is very high. So I know, speaking to some people in an organization that had the sort of 20%, the Friday sort of thing, that type of organization, the one.
20% like innovation time. So you get 20% of your
projects.
time to work on things that may not be on your core product.
Yeah, Google's, Google's the pioneer. Others of 3M and other organizations have had their own variant of it. I've not worked in those organizations, but I know people who've had. And it's true that was real. What it came with was the fact that they, the performance expected was very, was very high. So, and some people said to me, well, I have my time to do these experiments, but I must meet my performance targets. And I probably worked in the full week before I got to Friday to do my project. I'm not being negative about it. I'm just saying, when you dig underneath it, actually the empowerment you get, the flexibility you have, and so on, comes. It's not at a cost. It's part of it. It's part of a paradox, which you have to do both. You have to earn it.
I've worked in a company where we had unlimited holiday, and it was so interesting. Just there were so many different influences, like different factors that influenced what happened. But we'll save that for another time.
Did you? Sorry, I've got you. Sorry, just a quick one. Did you take more holiday in that environment than you would have done otherwise?
I took less than I would have done, and it, as people read about quite often, what happens is managers need to have conversations to encourage people to take holiday, but there are a bunch of factors that I think lead to the way, like what actually happens if that policy is implemented, that will be different for each company. Yes. So as to your point earlier, like if one company thought, oh, it works well in that company, in another company, we're going to copy it, it may not work because there are different factors at play. I'm going to take us on to, I'm going to try and make sure this isn't a conversation about the C-suite and we don't talk about the C-suite. So, so what we've done so far, we've shared views on culture, how we see culture. You've shared a view on what C-suite is. one of the things I'm really keen to understand is what, like, if somebody in the C-suite, if one of these senior management decides, okay, we are going to do something about our culture, what are the sort of reasons, like the causes for them thinking, okay, we're going to prioritize and focus on our culture? I'm really curious because I've got all these assumptions and guesses, but for someone who actually worked at that level on these topics, what has your experience been?
So I think up until relatively recently, the last few years, I think often the primary trigger for somebody in the C-suite to look at culture has been a problem, a risk, a crisis. You talked about a regulator saying you've got to do something about conduct. Think about the banks through the banking crisis and afterwards. Or there's been a fraud. Think about, VW. Think about, or a crisis, around, problem in the actual product. Think about Boeing. So often that's been the trigger to say, hang on, there's something going on in terms of how we interact with each other that we need to fix, because we're going to lose our license to operate. We're losing money. There's an immediate value problem. I think that that's still the case. There's often that's still the need, and it's often a very personal challenge to the C-suite in terms of you've got to fix it fast, otherwise X, Y, and Z will happen. I think there are increasing scenarios where those are not factors that are the pressing, the primary reason, but where an enlightened leader says, actually, I need to grow the organization, grow the profitability, the scale, the size, improve the brand standing, transform the organization. And actually, I understand that the cultural aspects of that change are central to it, not the bit that you get to right at the end once you've done everything else, or in practical terms, the last slide in the PowerPoint presentation. And I think those leaders, I don't think it's always the case that they've reached that view because they've been in a crisis and they've seen the downside of it. Sometimes that's the trigger to say, oh, I don't want that crisis. I don't want the regulator on my back, government or an activist share investor taking me on because we've got bad behaviors. And I don't want a repeat of that. I want to do something positive. That's an obvious sort of shift. But if you look at, and Satya Nadella is one of the classic examples in Microsoft. I think you've got somebody who is, thoughtful, well-read, curious, has a growth mindset, who thinks, I know it's down to the behaviors of the people in our organization. I know you worked for Microsoft, earlier in your career, where they see it's central to growth, absolutely central. And that's a big shift. And actually, so it's not something that the HR director is, culture, that means HR. Of course, HR has a critical role to play in enabling and rewarding and incentivizing cultural change. But I think now it is a topic that board members all feel able to talk about and actually want to talk about, even though, if you're the chief financial officer, you think, well, hang on, culture, they have their own team, of course, in terms of culture, but you'll think, I'm the numbers person. Well, I think I'm seeing an increasing number of chief financial officers in the C-suite who actually are sponsoring maybe initiatives around diversity, mental health, and so on, but also seeing the financial impact of a stronger culture. That's a big shift. I can't put a date on it, but it's the last few years. It's not something that's been happening for before that, at least on a consistent basis.
Yeah, when I hear that, I think to some of the opportunities I've had. I've been very lucky. I've worked with some great companies around culture, and the thing in common from the ones where it's not been an add-on is that the lead, like the motivation, the energy, and like comes from the leadership at the top. I partner with the people team or the HR team, but it's led from there,
yes,
generally,
exactly right.
rather than being led from there. So if that's happened, then, so if we say that there is the desire for one of however many causes for a company to say, okay, we're gonna prioritize and be really conscious about the culture as we progress in the company. let's think about the how, so approaches. So what have you seen, or based on your experience, are the things that you think that's worked well or things that haven't worked well? Could you share around approaches to developing the culture throughout the organization?
Yeah, I think I'm a big fan of, if you're in the C-suite looking to try and evolve the culture of an organization, big fan of getting out and speaking to customers, right? Customers, existing customers, prospective customers, and understanding what they would love, not just love the organization to do for them, with them, in terms of the product, services, experiences. Get out to the people on the front line, the people on the in the call centers at the moment, the people who are selling the products, wherever they are, obviously virtually at the moment, and actually understand what's possible, what would they love to do, but depending on the scenario, also what are the frictions. And if you ask simple questions like, what do we need to fix? Or what would you do if you were running this team? Very simple questions, open questions, and you actually genuinely listen to people. Even the people that you would, I think, often written off in these exercises, the people who have been in the organization a long time, might be a bit tricky, have a lot of power, right? But not the people to be positive or energetic. These are the people who actually have a lot of knowledge and actually care deeply about the organization. And actually, if you can harness these, as John Cassaback said, these critical few people who are not necessarily the people at the top of an organization chart. These are the people that people look up to. It's like if you're in a team and you said, who do people look up to and ask for counsel or wisdom about their career? Or who do we look to when there's a really difficult project we're going to run? Sometimes it's the same as the person at the top, but often it's somebody else. These are the people who, if you can get to know what they think, encourage them to get involved, and actually, if you like, convert them, they are more likely, other people are more likely to think, oh, she or he has changed their mind on this or tried something new and taken a risk. I might do so too. Too often, I would argue that culture change programs, or whatever title you want to use, go to the obvious people that are always going to be positive, always going to be catalysts, always going to be the advocates for it. And they will have a following, but they won't take enough of the rest of the organization with them. So I think get out onto the front line, understand, immerse yourself in the organization, identify the critical few people. And then I think you have to go through and identify a number of pilots where this links back to value. Pilots in an area or a division where you might say, you know what, we need to do customer experience differently. We're rubbish at, say, following up with customers. And that, by the way, has a sort of corollary in terms of following up within the organization in terms of actions after meetings or projects. Southwest Airlines is a classic example where they got that coherence between the customer expectation and the employee expectation. And so you identify an area, you think, if we followed up with customer complaints, for example, or customer requests, right, in terms of cross-selling or upselling particular products, we did that more effectively, we could make more money, etc. And by the way, that's something in the organization we're not so good at. So let's identify that behavior that we can change, identify that part of the business we should focus on, and then let's pilot it and trial it. So you set some sparks alive, you set some pilots, but they have to be related to the value of the organization. They're not just interesting, cool things you do on the side of the business. They're in the business. They are the business of the future.
That was a really thorough response. I appreciated that. One of in part of it where you mentioned identifying some of the people critical to it. Is that how did you describe it?
Yeah.
It made me think of like one activity people could do is, on one hand, you'd have your formal organization chart and diagram that kind of maps. You have to be considerate about who you do this with, but you could also map, like draw something like that, but of informal organization chart in terms of who are the influencers, how do things actually happen in an organization,
yes.
And then see where some of it will
And you need a mix. You need a
mirror it.
mix, right? You need a mix of the two, because you need the power, the people who actually hold, to your point earlier, the budgets, have real power. You need a mix of both, but you want it to be targeted enough so it doesn't take over the whole of the existing. You have to have the ongoing business still has to operate. So you said what doesn't work. Some organizations invest so much effort in some big cultural change effort that you think, well, who's running the business while we're doing all of this? Similarly, it can't be an elite group that people look at, because one, they're not representative. Two, they're not likely to then scale it. And three, people will be quite skeptical of them. It's trying to find the right mix of people.
So we've talked about an approach there, like things to consider as on the approach to developing the culture. And then you a lot of people will probably think, tick, you started with customers, and tick, you kind of linked it back to value. Talking about value, there's a lot of conversation around measuring culture.
Yeah.
Do you have a view on, if people in the C-suite, the senior management, are thinking, okay, I get this in theory, I think it's a good idea, I'm willing to do stuff, but like any of my investments, I want to measure what's going to happen as a result. How would you respond? How would you go about thinking about measuring culture?
So you're looking for changes as opposed to culture. So you're looking for, if we're investing our time in trying to evolve the culture, to what end? And it has to be a portfolio of measures. I know there's lots of new products, new services, new measurement tools on a specific aspect of cultural change, but there isn't one, in my view. So I would expect a portfolio that captures, at the easiest level, the degree of participation. How involved are people in the process? How engaged are they in the actual cultural change? So that gets a sense of, is the organization into this, right? Then there's a series of measures where I would focus on the, if you like, the behavioral or action related changes. So that example I talked about, following up with customers, you would set out a behavior and you would monitor with ideally input of the people affected rather than just self-reporting. Lots of surveys on culture tend to do lots of self-reporting, which, depending on your incentives, it's very easy to, oh, it's amazing, because I'm the person running it. So the second sort of set of measures is behavioral changes that you can identify as a result of these cultural sort of shifts you're trying to encourage. And then the key thing, as I said, is to try and get a range of people to observe the changes rather than one set. And I think there's a third element of measurement around ultimately the financial KPIs that are, to some degree, attributable to the cultural change. So I don't mean big picture numbers like the market cap of the organization and so on, but it may be, if you looked at, say, customer service, and you said, okay, so we want to, just to continue that example of following up, just to continue the theme, I would be looking at things like customer loyalty, churn rates, cross-sell opportunities, customer lifetime value, actual financial measures that you can't say were all down to the changes you made in culture, but are attributable enough for you to think, frankly, if those are going up by 5, 10, 15 basis points, and it's different from, say, the year or the year before, and you've stripped out some of the other influences, if you can do that, then I think you can get to, it's worth it. We're actually making it work. So it's got to work for the people involved, in terms of, how do the people in the organization feel? How do they self-report? Yes, you do need self-reporting on engagement and all those sort of HR type surveys. You need real actions and behaviors that people can measure. And ultimately you need, value and financial value that you can attribute to the cultural change. So it's a portfolio. There isn't one set of measures. And if anybody says, I'd love to hear anybody who says, and I'm happy to be proven wrong, if somebody says there's one measure that we can use in our organization to measure cultural change. But I think it's around having a portfolio, and that the important thing about that portfolio is it brings in the people in the C-suite from the different areas, from sales, from HR, from finance, from operations. You can all look at it And actually, they're all responsible because there is a measure or an aspect of measure that they are actually responsible for in their group or their function. That's really powerful in terms of sponsorship and actually getting stuff done, which is ultimately my definition of cultural change. Ba-boom.
Thank you for thank you for lifting a bit of a lid on the topic of measurement there. That's a lot for us to like start to consider for ourselves in our context. There's one final area I'm really keen for us to begin exploring, which is around the relationship between strategy and culture.
Yes, indeed.
Given like a lot of your work and experience has been focused on strategy, at least my understanding of it. And there's so much conversation about the two. So could you share, probably firstly, like what do you see strategy as? Like what does that mean to you? Like a kind of definition. And then secondly, share based on your experience, the relationship between strategy and culture.
Yeah, so strategy for me is around making a number of choices, integrated choices that help you win in a particular market, in a particular business. You may then articulate that through a plan on how to make that happen. But ultimately, it's about choices, it's about winning, it's about having a distinctive advantage and having a direction for the organization. I'm heavily influenced by Roger Martin's work, the former dean at Rotman, who's, I think, given one of the sharpest definitions. I think in terms of the relationship between the two, they've been separate for too long. Yes, there's the Peter Drucker quote of culture eating strategy for breakfast. Or is it the other way around? No, it's culture that way. Actually, they go together. And that's easy to say, but hard to sort of influence, because culture has either come at the end and strategy sort of had this hierarchy of being the most important part of the organization. The culture will just be the enablement of what you need to do. Well, I've talked about that. I think that's changing. In people-led businesses, people are one of your main assets. So if you don't get the culture right, you haven't got a chance of delivering the strategy. I think I can't name because that would be insensitive and probably breach some confidentiality. But I work with some media businesses where they've done some great culture work along the lines I've discussed, but they haven't been clear about their strategic direction, the choices of what they're going to do, for whom, in what way, the classic, value proposition to their customers, the business model they're going to use to deliver that. And what happens is, and let me use a caricature, you have an organization that's happy, it's collaborative, it's working well together, but they're not going in the right direction. And it's like they're waiting to be disrupted. I'm sure there's an analogy for the Titanic, but it's like being served drinks on the Titanic and feeling great, but we're actually just about to hit an iceberg, and that iceberg is the competitor. So a culture without a clear strategy is waiting for disruption. Similarly, we know that most strategies don't work. So you can have the best strategy in the world in terms of where you want to take the organization and why it matters and how you're going to win. But the how you win relies on playing to the strengths of the culture and actually making sure that people in the organization know what to do and what to do differently. That classic example, and I've been on stages and probably got it wrong myself, and coached people and advised people on stages on the C-suite, in town halls, virtually at the moment, physically in the past, where they've articulated a strategy. This is our organization. This is what we're here to do, for whom, this is how we're going to win. And here's what we've chosen not to do, which is rarely articulated. And the strategy, big tick. And then they go into, and we need to make this happen over this number of months or years. And here's the target we're going for. Tick, well done. They walk off the stage, everyone happy, great job. And the people in the room or on the call or on the Zoom ask themselves, so what do I do differently? How do I behave, act, feel? What values do I need to reflect on? And it's left missing. There's a translation gap. There's if you like a saying doing gap between it, which often happens in strategy. And I think the great thing about culture becoming more prominent as a concept and more important as an aspect of genuine transformational changes, they've moved to the same level in many C-suites. So they're talked about together. And there are many examples. Auto Trade is one example of one of the most successful transformations in the UK, at least. And whether you're into cars or not, that's not the issue. It's from being a magazine to an online marketplace platform, where, from what I understand from interviewing a number of the people who work there, and actually indeed my colleagues at PwC worked with them extensively, they clearly had a direction for the business, but it wasn't necessarily a nailed down strategy for the organization. They focused on the culture first. And this at the time was an organization that was, what I was told, pretty mercenary, pretty hard edged. And for them to focus on how are we going to work? How are we going to create an online digital organization? How is it going to work? As opposed to doing all the strategy work and then getting to the end of it, and I caricature it again, exhausted, thinking, oh, you've got the culture bit to go now. I thought we're done. They have to come together. And they are coming together in the more progressive organizations that I know.
Feels like this should become a masterclass, I reckon. David, there's so many things I want to go deeper on, but for now, I want to thank you. If people think, okay, I'm curious, I want to learn more about this, how can people follow your work or stay in touch?
So I have profiles on LinkedIn and on Twitter. I have a YouTube channel where I interview various management thinkers, executives, entrepreneurs. I do some strategy shorts, some short films, on which I also cover culture as well quite a lot. Or you can reach out to me at david@davidlancefield.com.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Matt. Great questions.